2020 is going to be a huge year. So what are the main things to look out for that you may not be looking for? Let's bring in the experts, Waj Ali, Nayyera, and Charlie Dent. To each and all, the best for the new year. Thank you for helping me out on the show. I appreciate it. So, Charlie, let's start with you. Your take is a Brexit warning.
It is indeed.
Hold on, Charlie. How am I messing this up already? It says Charlie goes first. Oh, okay. I screwed it up. Sorry, Charlie. Everybody, let's start over again. They'll never notice. Waj, yours is the death rattle of white supremacy. How so?
All right. So because we YOLO, we have FOMO. So BOLO for the death rattle of white supremacy. And what I mean by that is the death rattle of white supremacy in the United States and Europe has turned into a death march. And specifically, we're talking about an ideology and system, Chris, that says that white men are superior and must be at the top. And what we saw from 2016 with the election of Trump, every study has shown that the predominant factor for Trump voters was not economic anxiety, but racial anxiety, which was exploited by Trump. So what we'll see in 2020, and I want to say this out loud up front, is the mainstreaming and further popularization of white supremacist conspiracy theories by the Republican Party. We already saw in 2018 with the midterms invasion funded by George Soros, the Jewish globalist. And we've seen this mainstreaming by now right-wing politicians and Fox News. This will increase. We already saw Matt Shea, Republican legislator, being accused of domestic terrorism in Washington. And finally, we'll see the increase in white supremacist terror plots as Christopher Wray, Trump's picked FBI director, warned about. That happened in 2019. It was a record number. It's going to happen in 2020. We all have to look out for it.
Before I put it to the panel for voters, whether or not they are equally concerned, how is it a death rattle if you're worried about the increase of this malignancy?
Because the death rattle has caused a death march, because of the anxiety, because people are feeling replaced, because of the emancipation and elevation of women and people of color. You're seeing this reaction, just like Trump was a reaction to Obama, just like we're seeing the reaction to more men of color and women emerging. You're seeing this anxiety. And this anxiety has been exploited by the Republican Party, by Donald Trump. Mexicans are rapists and criminals. The Muslim ban, they're coming to get us. Invasion. So what we're seeing is this violent death rattle, which I think will get louder. It'll get more toxic. It'll be more mainstream before it's finally put to bed.
So it's going to get worse before it's
going to get worse.
It's going to get better. So, Nayyera, what do we do about something like that? In terms of, this is actually part of the subject of the closing argument that I have tonight, is what we learned about what is real in this country. Not that it's a terrible country, it's the opposite of that, but how you deal with your ills. Insight.
Well, you have to name it, right? Name it and shame it and acknowledge it. Pretending and giving it terms of economic anxiety and pretending it's not what it is isn't going to help anybody. The challenge we're seeing is that in the Trump administration, this has become part of government policy as well. We know that we have a rising domestic terror threat in the United States, but in 2017, the Department of Homeland Security shut down a division, the Interagency Task Force, that was dealing with interagency domestic terror networks, specifically right-wing extremism. So the government is no longer targeting this. And you have to wonder, I heard an FBI agent, a former domestic terror supervisor, say part of the challenge they're facing culturally is they don't feel comfortable going after people that might be the president's base.
Right. So your point kind of dovetails into this, which is forced inequality. Nayyera, you say be on the lookout for voter suppression. Where and how so?
Oh, it is becoming increasingly apparent that as we try to figure out whether or not you're going to vote for a Bernie or a Biden or a Trump, we need to also make sure that we can actually vote when we get to the polls. 17 million people were purged from voter polls records in the last 2 years alone. You look at Georgia, which just today announced that 100,000 people would not be allowed back on. Florida, where the entire state voted 1.5 million of people who paid their debt to society, former felons. They wanted them to have the right to vote. And the Republican state legislator said, we need to actually put some other restrictions on them. They sound like poll taxes, which is what it used to be in the civil rights era. But now they call it you have to pay all of your fines. So it comes up as states looking to make sure that their records are all clean and accurate. But it's much more insidious. It tends to focus on areas that are Democratic, that are minority, and it puts restrictions on voting that, frankly, we haven't seen seen since the 1960s.
And, look, some of this, especially when we talk about gerrymandering and other talk about voter IDs and what's misunderstood about that, there's an argument that goes back and forth. Felons voting, not so easy an argument. We saw at one of the town halls, Bernie Sanders said on the spot, yeah, I think even if you're in jail for the worst things, I think that you got to be able to vote because you're either for it or you're not. Tough sell, Nayyera. So how do you focus on what matters without getting into the realm of where people are going to push back?
I would say two things. Voting is a fundamental right as a citizen of the United States. So it has to be a very low threshold to deny somebody the ability to do that, because that is the way that you get to determine who represents you in your government. Second, the people of Florida, these are state rules. They spoke. They said this is how they want their state to be constructed, and the legislator tried to override the will of the people. So I think the state by state, the will of the people need to mobilize and activate. And if nothing else, check your registration. Make sure that you're still able to vote.
Now, Charlie, I knew I was right to get to you at some point here. All right, so you say Brexit. Why? Why should people here in America be thinking about Brexit at all?
Well, there is a Brexit warning, Chris. I'll tell you why. Look what happened there. Boris Johnson came out with a pretty simple expression, get it done, get Brexit done. Donald Trump says, keep America great. Very simple expressions, but I think there's a lesson for the Democratic Party in particular. A revolutionary candidate, an angry, in this case, Jeremy Corbyn, socialist, some would call it Marxist, anti-Semitic. This type of rhetoric is not what people are looking for in the UK. They're not looking for it here in the United States. So I warn people, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, if your goal is to defeat Donald Trump, they're not going to, a lot of Americans don't want to replace a right-wing, culturally based populism with a angry, left-wing, economically based populism. Big message there. I think voters are much more interested in incremental change. They're more measured statements. This country, I think, does better that way rather than some type of a revolutionary movement.
I hear you on I hear you on the hunger for normal, but Trump is the one who is doing a lot of the baiting that you caution about in terms of playing with race, playing with divisions, playing with diversity. Do you see that on the left, or do you see that as a warning for him and his?
Well, look, see, for Donald Trump, he's simply going to say, yeah, he won't say it himself, but people who will support him will say, yes, he has many faults that I don't like, but I cannot accept that, pointing to this type of, Warren or Sanders populism. I think that's it. This is not excusing any of Trump's racially incendiary rhetoric, which is despicable. But I tell you, it'll make it easier for people to justify their votes for Donald Trump if they see an angry left-wing populism
if Boris Johnson,
trying to fill the breach to replace Trumpism.
If Boris Johnson had actually run on killing the national health care program of the UK, he would lose. So just something to think about.
All right, listen. You gave us all a lot to think about. Thank you very, very much. Waj, the best to you and the family. Nayyera, thank you so much. Charlie, always a pleasure. Best to all of you for the new year. Thank you for helping us on the show.
Thanks.
All right, this is